welcome to this event of the SDG Action Weekend on accelerating sustainable development goals through risk-informed investments in infrastructure. This week, at the midpoint of the Sustainable Development Goals, we are taking stock of progress. And as you will see shortly, on many of the goals, we are not doing very well. A key part of the SDGs is investment in infrastructure, large physical economic infrastructure, as well as social infrastructure as a driver of human development, prosperity, and economic growth. And investment in infrastructure is lagging behind. And while that is happening, we are also losing a lot of infrastructure to extreme climate, weather, and disaster events, as we've seen in the last few weeks itself. What we saw in Libya, before that in Morocco, earlier during the year in coastal parts of the United States. We had a major earthquake earlier in the year in Turkey. So within that, how do we begin to measure risk? Risk of losses from events that we know could happen based on what we've seen in the past, but also in the context of a changing climate. So we'll hear about that from Aromar Revi, who has been one of the partners in putting together this work alongside our colleagues from UNDP, UNDRR, and others. So Aromar, the floor is yours. I also want to say, for those of us who are here, a summary of the report is on your table. And those who are watching online, they can go to CDRI website, cdri.world, and download the summary. The full report will be launched in the first week of October. Aromar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kamal. Excellencies, delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to try and be short, but I'll certainly be sharp, trying to build on work that many institutions over many decades have done. And I think a large number of governments across the world are actually struggling with, because we've seen in the post-COVID world that infrastructure has led the recovery of economies pretty much across the world. The challenge, of course, is, like we've heard over this year and the many years before that, is you're continuously struck by event after event that actually impact this, whether you're in the global north or south. So I'll try and speak to that question, again, fairly clearly. So the bad news is we are actually falling seriously behind in terms of SDG implementation. This is the current status dashboard as far as that's concerned, and we can see that as far as most of the goals are concerned across the globe, and of course it's very different in different countries and regions, we're not doing very well. About 2/3 have limited or no progress. About 20% of them are kind of okay, and some of them are actually in reversal. I guess both the good and the bad news is in a very large and rapidly growing economy, at least relatively speaking at the moment, our DRR losses are about 1% of global output. And with climate, we know that's going to increase. That's the real challenge. If you have 2.5% growth, you're losing about half of that, or slightly less than half of that at the moment, to disaster losses. You have a macroeconomic problem, and of course you have a tremendous development problem as we go forward. So basically, we need massive infrastructure investments to meet the SDGs. I've highlighted a few of them. Of course, 9 is what we're talking about today, but actually 9 and 8, the connection with good jobs and economic growth is absolutely central. This is the real issue we've been struggling with for over 15 years at the moment, how to bring together jobs, sort of green growth and infrastructure. But that is tied with pretty much all of the SDGs. Irrigation infrastructure is tied to hunger, health infrastructure is tied to SDG 3, education, of course, is a core issue. Water and sanitation and renewable energy actually drive a lot of the agenda, especially in the global south. And of course, the stuff that I've worked on for many years on sustainable cities and communities is the key driver of trying to enable equitable and sustainable growth. And finally, if goals 13, 14, and 15 are not dealt with adequately, which is what is now being called the blue, green, and gray infrastructure, then actually the rest of it doesn't hold together. So in some senses, the challenge before us, and this is in the middle of the review, the MTR process, we're actually talking about trying to bring together the Agenda 2030, which you can see on the slide, plus Polaris, plus Sendai, as Mami was talking about. Sendai is, in a sense, the orchestrating framework, the new urban agenda, because without that, you don't have any growth, fine? and you don't have a lot of the employment. Plus, thankfully, we have Kunming, Montreal now. So it's actually bringing together, all five of these elements that will enable SDG acceleration. And neither, governments struggle with this at local level, at national level, and internationally, I think the challenge for us is to build a framework where, apart from what we're talking about, the goals, the implementation systems, the key thing is we have to bring in the investment in the right places, because without the investment, things are not going to move forward. So basically, our investments that we're talking about to achieve this entire agenda is certainly of the order of 5 trillion or more to do all of these things. Now, the question is, do you do them in silos, or do you actually enable coordinated implementation? This is where the core question of both infrastructure governance and governance of resilience comes in. And we're not prepared for this, I would say, pretty much across the world, even in some of the more advanced economies. So I guess the economics in this report will show us this when it appears next month, is that simultaneous investment has economic benefits, and of course, multiple synergies that we could see, because the SDGs are a system which actually support each other. The other interesting piece of news is, and this is important because a lot of the critical infrastructures we're dealing with today are increasingly, let's take the case of renewable energy, being supported by private investment. So as you move into large-scale renewables, it's not only the gigawatt scale kind of large photovoltaic farms that you're seeing, but you're also seeing rooftop solar. That's both in the consumer end, and it's also supported by the private sector. So we're seeing a big shift now in the potential for investment in the sector, not only in terms of public investment, which is very critical, but also the crowding in, or I would say in some cases, the private sector leading this kind of process. So there's significant shifts underway in private investments. You can see that in this graph here. For example, the light sort of red or peach that you see up there is the alternative energy that's been going very quickly compared to traditional energy. This is the decarbonization. This is the pathway, the beginning of the pathway to 1.5 and net zero in some senses. But you also see social infrastructure as being very significant, knocked down a little bit by COVID. And of course, you see telecom becoming a very important driver, which is largely driven in most cases by private investment. But I guess the somewhat nasty news in this is that even if you take the large kind of, the Green New Deal from Europe, for example, the European Union, the share of low carbon resilient infrastructure in that mix, and the US is trying to do the same thing, is actually still very low. We have not reached the tipping point. So I guess the question is both for public investment and also sort of to drive private investment in the right place. And we saw this happening in Turkey. Basically, investment in resilient infrastructure is key to acceleration of both climate action and the SDGs. There seems to be a lot more resources in climate action. Actually, we are not seeing that hit the ground very much, especially on adaptation, a little bit more on mitigation. The question is, how can we achieve convergence? And if we achieve convergence, what kind of institutional structures and processes could we deal with? So in a sense, at least a contention that I have today is that resilient infrastructure is a systemic response to the global polycrisis we see ourselves in. So, take a lighter tone on this. You see these waves coming one after the other. COVID, of course, hopefully we're done with a lot of that. The recession, which is currently on, climate change, which is we're in the middle of a 1.5 overshoot process, and biodiversity collapse, along with, of course, the macroeconomic questions around debt and intergovernmental fragmentation that we've seen over the last couple of years. So basically, these are all connected, they're tied to each other, and they're driven by the same process. So if you want to address a global polycrisis, you have to deal with that with a systemic response. You cannot deal with systemic risk by dealing with things individually. It won't work. It'll only get worse, and you'll wonder why you are set back continuously. So basically, you need a set of local to global systemic responses to be able to simultaneously accelerate and move forward on SDG implementation. And this is a very challenging thing because neither governments nor, in some senses, our markets very well organized to make this happen. It's still very fragmented. So the contention one has, and that's what we were trying to deal with in the global report, is that resilient infrastructure is one of the critical systemic responses to the global polycrisis. So how does that work? It works in two ways. The first thing is, how do you develop resilience of the infrastructure itself? So, you have a port, and the port doesn't get knocked down by cyclonic storms or sea level rise, etc. But I think the more important thing that we're discovering just now is that you can build infrastructure for resilience so that your social and economic resilience, both because of institutional processes, community-based processes, etc., can actually help you. So it's not only the question of infrastructure governance, it's also the question of fiscal resilience. This is the reason why I think, especially in the climate case, more and more central banks are starting to test their systems to be able to try and understand what it means. That's a core question both for the IMF and otherwise. So basically, you need to do both things. That is, to strengthen your infrastructure, especially the harder systems and the softer systems, which are blue, green, gray, under nature-based solutions, but also basically build up your system so that social and economic resilience, which of course is the more important thing in the long run, can actually play itself out. So how does this actually happen? And I'm drawing here from the extensive literature that we put together in the IPCC over the last 7 years or so. This was kind of cleared earlier this year in the census report. And that is, if you want to deal with a systemic set of risks, you need to actually have a set of transitions that are implemented simultaneously. And we identify 5 different transitions. The energy one is obvious as far as climate is concerned. It's also obvious in terms of rapidly growing countries, because you can't have economic development, you can't get livelihood growth without actually having adequate access to clean energy for everybody. And this is a big question. It came up in G20 over the last year or so in India's presidency. And within that, the urban and the infrastructure systems are very critical. That's what's driving development, growth, employment in many parts of the world. And unfortunately, most of our systems are not designed either historically, which is including in the global north, and in the global south to be resilient. So the challenges are different. If you're building a rapidly growing urban economy, then you have to build properly so that you can actually, you get resilience dividends over the next 50 or 100 years. If you have Victorian infrastructure like this city has, for example, in New York, you have a big challenge because you've got to retrofit it. It costs a lot of money, takes a fair amount of time, but you need to do both things to make that happen. And then, finally, you need to do work on biodiversity and ecosystem services to sort of bring these things together. The idea of bringing together all of these agendas, that is the 2030 development agenda, climate adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity conservation with disaster risk, is what is called climate and disaster resilient development. That's the goal that we're looking at. It's tough. It seems somewhat, in some cases, a little bit out of the way of where governments currently work, but that needs to get done. The reason why it's important is because 60% of the infrastructure required to the 2050s is yet to be built. And this is especially true in the global south, in much of Asia, in pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other areas in Latin America, etc. So this is a big opportunity for us. We cannot, decarbonize. We can't deal with remaining within the 1.5 or maybe even 2 degree guardrails without making this happen. And this has tremendous convergence with the key policy questions that governments are dealing with: livelihoods, growth, jobs, improved quality of life, etc. So what are the new frameworks that we have? And I think that this report just now and the work that we've done from CDRI and UNDRR, etc., and UNDP over the last many decades just now is coming together. What are these frameworks? And I think the interesting thing about these frameworks are the science has actually caught up with the policy aspiration at the current point of time, partially because of new methods and processes. We actually have a whole range of different methods that are able to connect, starting from, I wouldn't say the hyperlocal, but certainly the local level upwards, looking at risks to a whole range of critical infrastructures. In fact, way back, maybe 20 years ago or more, India led that process of trying to look at multi-hazard risk across particular states in the country and build that out. So this is the global infrastructure risk model, which the report talks about, and the resilience index that Mami just mentioned just now, this is interesting because it's not that this information has not been available, but by and large, much of this information has been sitting with the reinsurance industry for many, many years, fine? But that's not sort of notionally a public good. But what I think the big shift just now is this is a publicly available data set. It's an analytical model that builds on critical infrastructure across the world and pretty much most of the critical hazards that are there. So one can access it, one can query it, and you can build the capacities of everything from local to national governments to look at this. And it does, historically, much of the work that's been done was done on geological hazards, on earthquakes and other such things, which are relatively easy to do. But now we're actually being able to embrace the climate-related hazards, and I won't bore you with the details here, but essentially what we can do is we can break down pretty much at the sub-national level what the infrastructure systems are like, and we can look at that region by region and look at that across a set of almost 10 different risks that are there. The bottom line on that, of course, like I mentioned earlier, is at the current point of time, our estimates are about, let's say, somewhere close to about 0.8 to about $1 trillion of effective loss of output at the moment because of the impacts that are there, which basically means that many national economies are at high risk. And the challenge, of course, is if your capital stock is impacted, it's not something that happens in this fiscal year. It plays itself out year and year afterwards because of the multiplier impacts that are there. And as we've seen, because many of these things are connected with each other, the health infrastructure is connected to the energy infrastructure, that's connected to how education is happening. We've seen that in COVID. The implication through the economic system becomes quite significant. So there are great, we have the analytical ability to understand this by region and look at what's happening here. And as an example here, we have for the first time, this looks at heat, which has become a very big issue now, including all over the world, in Europe, North America, and of course in South Asia, we'd have a terrible time over the last year or so. So basically the interesting thing now is we know what the risk exposure is as far as different hazards are concerned. So the quick breakdown is 1% of output. Of that, 70% of it comes from climate-related risks. So we have the numbers just now. And we can break that down. Obviously, in some parts of the world, it's less and more, and it will change over time. And 30% of it coming from geohazards. Fine. Now, the important thing in terms of the dynamism of this process is geohazards, in terms of overall proportion, may not change, though they're very particular in the Ring of Fire in particular countries. These are big questions at the moment. And sometimes they come at us by surprise, like in Morocco at the current point of time. But the climate hazards are certainly going to grow in terms of intensity and frequency, which means that we know that we have to prepare for them, especially because we're headed for a 1.5 overshoot. So in some senses, we have some precursor sense certainly over the short run, but certainly over the medium run, of how this could play itself out. And we're in a much better position just now to try to advise national governments and of course, and even sort of central banks, etc., on how this will play itself out. The other thing that's interesting is because the breakdown is done sector by sector, we also know where the risk concentrations are the highest, which again means that, if you look at a Pareto process, let's say, you know how to prioritize your interventions depending on which country you are. Obviously, a country in Latin America or in the Caribbean may be quite different from something in the Middle East, etc. So the big high-level point here is that roads and railways, basically transportation, telecom, power and energy, contribute to about 80% of the total annual ROSC at the current point of time. Now, as we can model how these infrastructures can build out over time, as for example, there's universal coverage of core services, SDG 6, 7, etc., in Africa and let's say South Asia, we'll get a sense of how much risk you can accumulate in that particular process, let's say. So, the science is giving us a fairly clear perspective just now of what are the major hazards and how you can deal with them, and also which sectors we need to look at. Obviously, because the 2030 agenda is focused on leaving no one behind, the most vulnerable populations, have to be very carefully looked after, whether it's in the Arctic at one end, small island states at the moment, or socioeconomically vulnerable populations in low and middle income countries. So you need to kind of balance these things out. So we've got a much better sense of this as far as that's concerned. So the core question for us is there a potential for an infrastructure resilience dividend? And what would it look like on the outcome? Obviously, avoided asset loss, fine? Your buildings will not be destroyed, your bridges will not come down, etc. That's the obvious thing that's there. But I think the very important thing in an interconnected world where the economic activity and livelihoods are important is reduced service disruption. So, for example, in a power system, it's not the cost of replacing the power plants and the transmission systems that are the real cost. It is really the cost of shutting down of the power networks, because that dramatically impacts livelihoods and the economy as far as it's concerned. Better and more reliable public services. We know that if we need to decarbonize rapidly, public services are going to be very, very critical to making this happen. And of course, accelerated economic and social development that sit on this. And if you're able to do this in a sensible way, you can reduce carbon emissions. If you're able to think this through, your policy is organized, and you can potentially enhance biodiversity. If you're sensitive to these questions and you're not going in particular directions that sort of push back against nature, you can improve water quality, which is one of the most critical crises. We know that the blue and water planetary boundaries have just been breached. An article appeared in Science just 3 days ago. And of course, for those of us that live in countries which have very poor air quality because of industrialization, it'll help you improve air quality. So these, in a sense, are the tangible outcomes. You can link them to SDGs. But even before the SDGs, these are the questions that national governments are always concerned about. So the question is, if you can bring these things together, you have the opportunity of dealing with current risk, you can deal with economic development opportunities and risks, and of course, climate risks as it starts building up, and hopefully not trying to overcome us as far as that's concerned. So how do you make this happen? I guess the advantage of this framework and the analytics that we have at the moment is that you can start breaking it down into small bits. So there's a lot of mathematics and fancy computer simulation and stuff that's there. So we have the analytical methods of bringing together hazards exposure, climate change, risk metrics, and taking that down into individual infrastructures. And as countries build out their inventories much better, we can actually try and look at how things work in the future. I guess the key thing for us here is that once you have that and you can start to quantify risk much more clearly, it becomes the first step for both public institutions and certainly for private investors to manage their portfolio risks. Because we know from both risk theory and otherwise, the only way to manage risk is by managing it in a portfolio. If you're going to go one by one, it's not going to work as far as you're concerned, both economically and financially. So now we can actually assemble portfolios of different types of risks. You can deal with cyclical and counter-cyclical effects in kind of systematic ways to move that kind of forward. So where does that leave us? The annual investment requirements in terms of infrastructure financing, this is a well-known fact. There's a huge infrastructure financing gap. Forget about the resilient infrastructure financing gap. But the annual requirement for infrastructure is about 3 trillion or so. The challenge, of course, is that the investments in low and middle income countries is probably 1/10 of that investment. So, you have to build up the investment in any case. This is the core question of SDG financing, how to redo the multilateral development system. That's an ongoing discussion that many of us are part of. But the question is, if you're going to do that, you might as well do it to support resilient infrastructure, because that's going to bring you quick dividends on this. And like Mami was saying, the question is, how is the cost benefit going to play itself out? So the risk models can help us do things that are very important as we go into implementation. It can help us develop national infrastructure resilient policies and plans that bring together all of these things. And obviously the situation in Indonesia is going to be very, very different from that in, let's say, Colombia or another country, or even in a large country like India. What's happening in the Himalayan region is going to be very different from other areas that are exposed to other kind of risks. You have the ability now to be able to build these processes so that the policies and plans are connected with the ground reality. And once they are consistent, they help both as regulatory as signaling devices so that public investors and public finance and private investors can help define and manage risk much more clearly. Because part of the challenge in risk is about the cost of capital. The cost of capital is very, very significant in places that are marginalized, that are difficult to get through. And a lot of that is because risk information is just not available. So the next step on that, of course, is to build project pipelines. And again, bring back this idea to the question of portfolios. We have a whole range of new methods just now that look at the connection between biodiversity, climate, and social vulnerability, etc. So when you're able to look at that in a consistent manner, there's a potential to build these resilient infrastructure project pipelines that reduce portfolio risk, and then hopefully, as the financial system becomes more supportive, whether it's through ESG financing or other instruments that you have, including green bonds, etc., can reach out to deal with that. So I'll sort of close off here with saying that we need to build national resilience financing and expenditure plans. These are not kind of things that should only be situated in the global north. In fact, it is in rapidly growing countries, in the low and middle income countries, and the most vulnerable, that you need the plans more than anything else. Because if you look at, let's say, a country like Haiti, and we know what's gone on over the last decades, the value of having this in place, getting the right infrastructure investment, getting the right financing, and also getting in the cat bond that actually covers the risk, is even more significant in macroeconomic terms and the lives of the people than otherwise. So the value is actually sometimes much more in the margin than in the sort of, I would say, in the larger economies. But even there, it's a very significant question. So we have to move towards building these national resilience and financing plans. The science is moving us forward to enable that to happen. We have to move from the governance end, from the public finance end, I would say in some senses, to be able to open up these processes. Because again, to pick up on those three critical infrastructures, road, rail, telecom, energy and power, private investment, especially as we're trying to decarbonize, is driving innovation in that space. If you're going to hold that back, then you're either going to get left out or you're not going to see the dividend. So one has to think, I guess, or walk on 2 feet as far as that's concerned. So basically, governments have to massively scale up public investments to be able to crowd in, investments that come from other areas, and also redirect private finance into infrastructure. There's no reason, if your signaling is right, that people will continue to invest in dirty technology, in carbon-intensive processes, apart from strategic and other interests, because they have no other option. Their carbon space has unfortunately been taken as far as that's concerned. So
what are the big next steps here? I would say three big things. One is something that we haven't had and we now have just now is better risk models. So deepening the global infrastructure risk model is important. And it's not easy because countries and within countries, regions have to build out their infrastructure inventories effectively. They have to build the institutional capacity to use these risk models. Having a risk model that's sitting in New York or Geneva or somewhere else is not very useful. And this is not very complicated to deal with, but it can be sort of built out. The second thing is we need to have clear country assessment of the policy options and enabling conditions. And why is that? Because infrastructure is specific to the development trajectories, the pathways that each country is going through. Depending on what stage you are, depending on what challenges you have, it may be energy, it may be roads, it may be just schools or healthcare that's important. So we need to do three things to make that happen. You need to assess feasible and effective implementation options at the country scale, or in a large federal country, you need to do that regionally. The second thing is you need to estimate your financing gaps, because without that, you can't see what's necessarily happening. And once you have that, then you'll have at least half a chance of identifying the barriers, the enabling conditions, and the policy instruments which will enable the conversion of these interests, which will make this possible. I mean, it's a big ask in some senses, fine? To be able to converge and bring together all these agendas inside governments. Governments don't work like this, but inevitably, given the poly crisis, I would imagine there aren't too many places to go apart from making this happen. And then finally, we need to build concrete pathways to risk-informed infrastructure investment, which means you have to have frameworks in place, you have to have appropriate and policies that are not sort of pulling in different directions, and you have to have financing plans for particular sectors that actually work itself out. If you don't have the whole range of different projects and pipelines as far as that's concerned, even a well-meaning financial institution, the MDBs across the world, can't finance you because you don't have something to finance in some senses. And finally, and this is one thing that's come up again and again, I think, especially in the G20 discussions, you do need to establish a risk-informed, resilient infrastructure facility, because this is specialized stuff. It's tied in with many, many different elements of development. We do have existing arrangements that are there, the Green Climate Fund, whatever it is. There are a whole range of these things. But I think focusing on infrastructure is going to be very critical in terms of actually achieving what we're trying to do. And I think we're making fairly good progress because of this multilateral cooperation from across the world. So what Asia has not got, we're learning from Latin America. What Latin America has not got, we're learning from Africa. So I think that is the real opportunity we have to try and move this forward. And I'm really glad, since CDRI was kicked off here in 2019, we're starting to see, at least within the 40, 50 countries in CDRI's fold, with all other partners, that this is moving forward quite quickly. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.